Have you ever held a belief so tightly that it felt like part of your identity, only to have it shattered by a single, unexpected moment? It is unsettling, almost embarrassing, when something you thought was obvious turns out to be completely wrong. Because for years, the world carried a quiet, unspoken insult about the Philippines, an insult hidden beneath jokes, smirks, and casual remarks. People said Filipino English was cute, amusing, almost like a playful imitation of the real thing. They said it wasn't standard. They whispered it as if the entire world had already signed an agreement behind closed doors. Filipinos speak English, but not quite correctly. Even Captain James Russo believed it. A seasoned American pilot, crisp uniform, silver wings, 20,000 hours in the sky. He had flown through typhoons, dust storms, and runways carved into mountains. But nothing shaped his confidence more than his belief that he came from the country that defined aviation English. English was his terrain, his instrument, his advantage. And somewhere along the way, he learned to look down, not maliciously but unconsciously, on accents that didn't match his own. Even one of the most respected professors he ever trained under, a man with a Harvard crest pinned to his office wall, once said during a seminar, "Filipino English is functional, yes, but it's not the voice of global aviation." The class nodded. James nodded. No one questioned it. Why would they? When a man with that kind of pedigree makes a declaration, people don't argue. They absorb it as truth. But what if I told you that months later, that same professor would find himself standing in the middle of Ninoy Aquino International Airport, quietly whispering, "My God, I had no idea," after witnessing something that made him question every assumption he had ever taught. But the story does not begin with him. It begins with James, sitting alone in the cockpit of a grounded aircraft in Seattle, staring at his reflection on the dark glass of the flight deck. He looked composed, almost stoic, yet a storm brewed beneath the surface. There was something he hadn't told anyone, not even his wife. A recent medical review had raised concerns about the sharpness of his auditory perception during high-stress communication. It was subtle, but in aviation, a single moment of misheard instructions could cost lives. He feared losing the sky, losing everything. During a layover flight weeks later, something unexpected happened. As he waited in the crew lounge at Changi Airport, sipping lukewarm coffee and barely listening to the chatter on the radio scanner, a voice broke through, calm, crisp, and unmistakably precise. The cadence was warm, but controlled. The enunciation was gentle, yet firm. It carried a steady confidence with no hint of hesitation. "Philippine Airlines Flight 218, you are cleared to land. Runway 06. Maintain current heading." The moment was small, ordinary, just another air traffic instruction. But the clarity of that Filipino voice cut through James in a way he could not explain. It startled him. It contradicted everything he believed. And for the first time in a long time, he felt humbled. He didn't know why that voice lingered in his mind. But it did. It stayed with him like a quiet question he could not yet answer. And without realizing it, that single moment was already pulling him toward Manila, toward a truth waiting to confront him and a transformation he never saw coming. James did not plan to think about that Filipino voice again, yet it echoed in the back of his mind like a gentle tapping on a locked door. He tried to ignore it. He tried to drown it in paperwork, in simulator drills, in the noise of his own frustration. But something inside him refused to let it go. Maybe it was because everything else in his life was spiraling downward. Or maybe, deep inside, he sensed that clarity, real clarity, was slipping away from him in ways far beyond language. His medical reports haunted him. Words like possible auditory fatigue and inconsistent high-frequency response burned into his memory. For a pilot, such phrases feel like a sentence. He was too young to retire, too proud to quit, too scared to admit he was afraid, and too angry to accept that his body might betray him after years of disciplined service. He tried seeking help quietly, checked specialists in Los Angeles, consulted a clinic in Tokyo recommended by a fellow captain, even visited a cutting-edge auditory lab in Berlin during a long-haul layover. Everywhere he went, the answer felt the same: expensive tests, sterile rooms, and vague conclusions that sounded like carefully framed versions of "there's nothing more we can do." Each attempt chipped away at him. Each disappointment made the walls feel closer. He began waking up with a heaviness he couldn't name. His confidence fractured. His voice, once steady, sometimes trembled during briefings. The sky felt farther from him than ever, and for the first time, the man who spent his life above the clouds felt like he was sinking beneath them. One night, after another failed appointment, he sat alone in a hotel room overlooking Narita Airport. The neon lights flickered against the window. Aircraft lights blinked in the distance, but instead of comfort, they filled him with dread. He wondered what it would feel like to give up everything he had built. He wondered how he would explain it to his daughter, who always said, "Dad, you fly like angels do." He closed his eyes. And strangely, the memory that came back to him wasn't a colleague, or a diagnosis, or a warning. It was that voice, the Filipino voice from the radio. Calm, clear, steady. It replayed in his mind like a message he had forgotten to interpret. That was when he decided to look somewhere he had never looked before. Quietly. Almost out of desperation, he searched online for alternative auditory evaluations in Southeast Asia. And that was when he saw it. A small aviation medical center in Manila, run by a former Philippine Air Force surgeon. The reviews spoke of compassion not found in big institutions. Pilots wrote about being treated like human beings, not case files. Some even mentioned that the assessments there helped them regain clarity, not just physically, but mentally. James hesitated. Manila was never on his map. He knew nothing about the country beyond clichés. But something in him, that same quiet tug he felt at Changi, urged him forward. He booked a flight without telling anyone, not even his co-pilot, not even his wife. As the confirmation email dinged on his screen, he felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not hope, not yet. But the faintest spark of possibility, a question with no answer. Was the Philippines truly the solution? He wouldn't know until he got there. The descent into Manila felt different from any approach James had ever flown, even though he was seated among passengers this time, anonymous and stripped of the authority his uniform usually gave him. As the plane dipped through layers of soft clouds and the lights below grew brighter, he felt an uneasiness he hadn't admitted to anyone. He wasn't sure if he was arriving as a pilot seeking clarity or as a broken man grasping at his last chance. But the moment the aircraft touched down, he experienced something he could not explain. A familiar voice, broadcast across the cabin speakers, welcomed passengers to the Philippines with a warmth that felt both professional and strangely soothing. The cadence was balanced, the tone calm, the English crisp. It was so different from every stereotype he had absorbed over the years that it left him unexpectedly still. As he walked through the airport, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The people speaking around him. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with a steady politeness, as if each sentence was a soft bridge offered to another person. Families gathered at arrival gates, laughter folding into prayers, children greeting returning relatives with an excitement that felt almost sacred. A security officer gave him directions with such gentleness that he found himself thanking the man twice, unsure why the interaction moved him. But the real turning point came the next morning, when he arrived at the Aviation Medical Center. The building was modest, not the gleaming tower he expected. But there was something disarming in its simplicity. Inside, a receptionist greeted him with a smile so warm he momentarily forgot why he was there. Her English was clear, natural, unforced, not the comedic stereotype he once heard jokes about, not the broken rhythm people mocked on TV. It was simply human. He sat in the waiting area listening to the nurses chatting softly, switching effortlessly between Filipino and English, bridging two worlds with ease. Their voices were gentle, melodic, but precise. He found himself closing his eyes, not because he was tired, but because it felt peaceful in a way medical spaces never did. When Dr. Ramos finally called his name, James expected clinical efficiency, maybe even a hint of condescension he often encountered in large institutions abroad. Instead, he met a physician whose calm demeanor instantly eased his tension. The doctor listened, truly listened, as James explained his fears. There was no rush, no impatience, no judgment, only quiet understanding. The examination was thorough, but what shook James wasn't the medical process. It was the doctor's voice, steady, articulate, compassionate. The English he spoke was firm but tender, every instruction delivered with the clarity James once believed only Americans or Europeans possessed. At one point, Dr. Ramos noticed James staring at the wall, lost in thought. He paused and asked gently, "Captain, are you all right?" For reasons he could not explain, James felt something inside him soften. He nodded, but the truth was more complex. For the first time in months, he felt safe, grounded, seen. As he left the center, stepping into the humid Manila afternoon, something shifted within him, very subtly, like a small beam of light cutting into a dark room. The Philippines had not cured him. It had not solved his crisis. Not yet. But it had given him something he had not felt in a long time. A quiet, surprising sense of hope. In the days that followed, James found himself wandering through Manila not as a tourist, and not quite as a patient, but as someone trying to understand why he felt lighter each morning he woke up. It was subtle at first, like the gentle way Manila mornings begin with church bells mixing with the rhythm of jeepneys. Something about the city softened him. And the people seemed to notice him, without making him feel judged. They acknowledged him with simple nods, warm greetings, smiles that asked for nothing in return. It wasn't the kind of politeness he learned in training manuals. It was something deeper, something that came from the culture's marrow. The next appointment with Dr. Ramos became the moment everything changed, not because of a medical revelation, but because of what happened in the waiting room. An elderly Filipino man, frail, breathing with effort, sat across from him. James noticed his trembling hands and instinctively offered him his seat closer to the fan. The man smiled with gratitude and whispered, "You remind me of my son. He works overseas. I haven't seen him in 5 years." His English was imperfect, accented, but filled with sincerity. Before James could respond, a nurse approached to assist the old man. Her voice was soft and grounded, each word spoken with the kind of patience that felt almost sacred. She wasn't just doing her job. She was caring for him, as if he were family. The way she guided him, the way she reassured him, the way her English carried warmth rather than strict formality. It hit James with unexpected force. He realized he had spent years thinking language was about superiority, about who sounded most correct. But in that moment, watching a nurse speak with the tenderness of a daughter reunited with her father, he understood something fundamental. Clarity isn't only about pronunciation. It's about intention, compassion, presence. Later that afternoon, when it was his turn to enter the evaluation room, Dr. Ramos asked him to perform a series of auditory tests. As James repeated instructions, responded to cues, and communicated through simulated cockpit scenarios, something astonishing occurred. His responses were sharper, his reactions steadier. There was no confusion, no hesitation. It was as if the clarity he felt around him had begun to seep inward. Dr. Ramos paused at one point, studying the readings. Then he looked up and said gently, "Captain, I don't think you're losing your hearing. I think you've been losing your peace." The words hit him harder than any diagnosis, and he realized, right there in that quiet room in Manila, that he had allowed fear to distort his world. He had allowed pride to blind him. He had allowed stereotypes to shape his understanding of people he had never truly seen. He felt something break open inside him. Not pain, release. The kind of release that comes when you finally stop fighting the truth and let it wash over you. Later that evening, as he stepped outside and felt the warm Filipino breeze on his face, he whispered something he had never imagined he would say. "I think I belong here." It wasn't a declaration. It was an awakening. He had come seeking answers for his ears. Instead, the Philippines had spoken to his heart. In the days after his final evaluation, James found himself sitting on a quiet bench outside the medical center, watching people move through the Manila afternoon light. Families walked hand in hand. Students chatted in a mix of English and Filipino. Nurses hurried between shifts with tired steps and unwavering smiles. The world around him felt alive in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It was as if the city itself breathed a kind of gentle strength, one that didn't need to boast to be seen. And somewhere in all of that, James realized he had changed, not with fanfare, but with the steady, patient influence of a culture that knew how to heal without announcing it. He thought back to his first impressions, the stereotypes he believed, the quiet prejudices he carried without ever questioning where they came from. He remembered the Harvard professor's remark, the jokes he once laughed at, the unconscious hierarchy he placed on accents. It all felt distant now, almost childish, because the truth had unfolded before him not through a grand revelation, but through small human moments. A nurse's gentle touch, a doctor's calm voice, an old man's quiet gratitude, a receptionist's warm greeting. Every encounter had carried the same unmistakable signature: kindness without performance, clarity without arrogance, English spoken not to impress, but to connect. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds around him, the rhythm of the street vendors, the soft prayers from a nearby chapel, the effortless switch between languages. And he felt something shift inside him again, this time deeper, as if a lock he didn't know existed had finally clicked open. It became clear to him why Filipino English was becoming the voice of the world's airlines. Not because it mimicked anyone, not because it tried to sound Western, but because it carried something the world rarely talks about: a balance of clarity and compassion. Calm under pressure, warmth under stress, a kind of grounded humanity that reassures rather than intimidates. He thought about the air traffic controller whose voice first caught his attention weeks earlier. A stranger who unknowingly began unraveling years of assumptions. He wished he could thank them, because that single moment had set off a chain reaction that led him here, not just to Manila, but to a new understanding of himself. Before leaving, he visited a small chapel tucked between two busy streets. He took a seat in the back pew, surrounded by flickering candles and whispered prayers, and in that stillness, he whispered his own. Not a prayer for his career, not a plea for his hearing, but a simple expression of gratitude. "The Philippines gave me back more than clarity," he said quietly. "It gave me myself." When he finally boarded his flight home, something felt different. The world outside the window didn't intimidate him anymore. The skies looked familiar again, not as a battlefield of expectations, but as a place he could return to with peace. And as he heard a Filipino flight attendant speak over the intercom with the same calm, polished English that once surprised him, he felt a swell of admiration he could not contain. The voice was steady, warm, welcoming, the kind of voice passengers instinctively trust. It struck him then, the world hadn't misjudged Filipino English because it was weak. It misjudged it because it didn't understand the strength hidden beneath its gentleness. In a world fractured by conflict, noise, division, the Philippines stood as a quiet reminder that clarity can be kind, that strength can be humble, and that the most trusted voices are often those shaped not by pride, but by compassion. And for the first time in his life, James felt proud to say it out loud, not as a slogan, not as a compliment, but as a truth he now knew in his bones. The Filipino voice is the one the world listens to.